Before we get to our main story today, there was an interesting bit of news that broke about probably one of the highest profile Catholic podcasters, Mr. Matt Fradd, who some of you may have heard this, but if not, well, we will go right to it. Here is a post from the Daily Wire's X account. Big announcement. Matt Fradd and Pints with Aquinas are coming to the Daily Wire in 2026. We're excited for Matt to continue inspiring our culture to think more clearly, live more virtuously, and love God more deeply. Pints isn't changing, it's just getting bigger. So a bigger pint with Aquinas, I guess. E. Michael Jones with the He Who Pays the Piper calls the tune. He's not a fan of this, as is neither are the guys at Avoiding Babylon. Pints with Maimonides. I will tell you personally, I'm not a fan of the Daily Wire. I do like Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles. Not a fan of the Daily Wire. I will, however, be withholding any negative judgment against Matt Fradd or his intentions or anything else until he does things that shows that there's a problem. There are people who are concerned about this, though, wondering if he's going to change his tune on things, not have any hard topics on his show, that kind of thing. For a variety of reasons, some of which you can guess. But that's the big news. And there's a lot of essentially mixed reaction to this. Just a Catholic I know on Facebook says, not sure what this actually means for brother Matt Fradd, but some folks are upset. I'm concerned he'll be limited since the money almost always determines the outcome. My initial feeling is this is not a good move. I hope I'm wrong. But Matt Fradd recently said he was toying with the idea of letting Pints with Aquinas die anyway until this opportunity was dropped onto his lap. And what's interesting, for good or for ill, Daily Wire has more Catholics working there than anyone, according to Andrew Clavin. So who knows what this will mean for the future? The comment section is flooded with fans who are dejected, concerned, or suspicious. He'll clearly lose a lot of people in the short term. People calling it, just another Catholic Incorporated operation. One way or another, pray for Matt Fradd and pray for the folks at the Daily Wire. But it's interesting news to see nonetheless. This is especially in light of a Catholic organization called Pelican Plus having started up that, has some names and faces you might be familiar with. Kennedy Hall, Nick Cavazos, and a few others who are kind of the flagship hosts there. I was offered an opportunity to join it, but couldn't make the connections work. And I have some questions. But I will not air that stuff here. Just as a general thing, you're seeing this kind of thing starting to play out in where Catholic voices are getting snapped up for various social media companies. So please pray that those involved in this do so with and in accordance with the will of God, as we should for all things. Now, the question here today, did Cardinal Cupich incur an automatic excommunication, an anathema, infallibly declared by an ecumenical council? We're going to go here to the Council of Trent, because the council that the church these days pretends didn't happen, or was replaced by Vatican II in some way. Now, they were here talking about what you're about to hear. The context is this: the arch heretic Martin Luther said a number of things about the Mass, all of which were negative. Here we're talking about the traditional Mass. The various offerings of the Roman Rite before quo primum would have all looked a lot more like today's TLM than anything else. Quo primum suppressed any newer forms of the Mass. That's key to remembering this. Said you can't actually promulgate a new version of the Mass. Theologians debate whether that's actually binding or not on a pope. I'll leave that for them to decide. But there are anathemas attached to this. For example, Canon 1 from the 22nd session, Canon 1 says, if anyone saith that in the Mass a true and proper sacrifice is not offered to God, or that to be offered is nothing else but that Christ is given us to eat, let him be anathema. Meaning, if you deny that it is the sacrificial nature of the Mass, you incur an anathema. If anyone saith that by those words, do this for the commemoration of me, see Luke chapter 22, verse 19, Christ did not institute the apostles' priests or did not ordain that they or other priests should offer his own body and blood, let him be anathema. Canon 3. If anyone saith that the sacrifice of the Mass is only a sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving, or that it is a bare commemoration of the sacrifice consummated on the cross, but not a propitiatory sacrifice, or that it profits him only who receives, and that it ought not to be offered for the living and the dead for sins, pains, satisfactions, and other necessities, let him be anathema. This is clearly a repudiation of Protestant doctrines on the liturgy. Canon 4. If anyone saith that by the sacrifice of the Mass a blasphemy is cast upon the most holy sacrifice of Christ, consummated on the cross, or that it is thereby derogated from, let him be anathema. Canon 5. If anyone saith that it is an imposture to celebrate masses and honors of the saints, and for obtaining the intercession with God, as the Church intends, let him be anathema. Canon 6. If anyone says that the canon of the Mass contains errors, and is therefore to be abrogated, let him be anathema. And this is the first section where Cardinal Cupich applies. He said that the canon of the Mass, one of his critiques was that the Mass had developed these accretions that were erroneously put in as a homage to the monarchies and the royal courts of the time, that they were essentially errors that needed to be removed. Covered it, his letter, gave it to you in his own words just a few days ago on this channel. That is the first time where, in theory, he may have attained an automatic excommunication. But let's continue. Canon 7. This is the big one. If anyone saith that the ceremonies, vestments, and outward signs with which the Catholic Church makes use of in the celebration of Masses are incentives to impiety, rather than the offices of piety, let him be anathema. He described the Mass as a show, that the traditional liturgy of the Church was a show, a spectacle, that people weren't actively participating, but it was essentially just a show. People say that about the new Mass. He's saying about the old. Again, remarkable if you've ever been to a traditional Mass. Canon 8. If anyone saith that Masses wherein the priest alone communicates sacramentally are unlawful and are therefore to be aggravated, let him be anathema. Pope Francis did this when he banned the traditional Mass, banning private Masses in a lot of places. Canon 9. If anyone saith that the rite of the Roman Church, according to which a part of the canon and the words of consecration are pronounced in a low tone, is to be condemned, or that the Mass ought to be celebrated in the vulgar tongue only, keyword here is only, or that water ought not be mixed with the wine that is to be offered in the chalice, for that is contrary to the institution of Christ, let him be anathema. You do see this one sometimes, but again, the key word here is only. On paper, the Church allows for the new Mass to be offered in Latin. On paper, many bishops have banned that, and one has to wonder if in so doing they have incurred an anathema. Again, we will let people with a higher ecclesiastical pay grade than anybody watching this make that decision. But this got to be interesting because, well, we go here to the Catholic Herald for their coverage of the story, because now the media is picking up on Cardinal Cupich's weird message that he issued. Cardinal Cupich calls a traditional Latin Mass a spectacle. A spectacle is an occasion for impiety. It is. You don't put the words pious and spectacle together. It's a nonsensical phrase. This is an opportunity for impiety. He's not the only one who said this. In fact, most of the modernists, including many of them post-Vatican II popes, have said that the traditional Mass is something akin to a spectacle. Chicago's Blaise Supich has asserted that the traditional Latin Mass was more of a spectacle rather than the active participation of all the baptized. In a reflection on the liturgical reforms which came from the Sacrosanctum Concilium, that's a document from Vatican II, one of the four constitutions of Vatican II, the Cardinal argued that the document drew on scholarly research, which revealed, quote, adaptations that were introduced over time, which incorporated elements from imperial and royal courts. That reform, he contends, aims to purify the liturgy of, quote, these adaptations to enable the liturgy to sustain the Church's renewed sense of herself. And he says it that way to make you think that the traditional Mass is not capable of sustaining the Church's sense of herself. This is why there are 2 points in there in what the Council of Trent declared as anathemas that might apply to Cardinal Supich. The cardinal made plain that the renewed liturgy, called it renewed because the traditional mass needed renewal, the liturgy of the church needed renewal because it was insufficient for grace, according to these guys. They've said this repeatedly. He made plain that the renewed liturgy is not simply a matter of external form, but of ecclesial identity and mission. And that is why we say it's a new religion, because the traditional mass, the mass developed organically from at least the 4th century, if not earlier, does not fit with the identity of the church anymore. Change the identity of the church, you change the religion. That's what they did. He emphasized that the measure of authenticity in Eucharistic celebration lies in concern for those in need, meaning man-centered. It is this criterion by which the authenticity of our Eucharistic celebrations is judged, not that it is fitting worship for God according to what he has decreed for how to properly worship him, but man's needs. He went further, still describing the Mass not merely as ritual, but as the locus of solidarity with the poor in a fractured world. The cardinal made his remarks in the context of the council's renewed vision of the church. He cited the papal letter de Lexite, noting that the, quote, Second Vatican Council represented a milestone in the church's understanding of the poor and God's saving plan, a theme initially marginal in the preparatory documents, but brought to prominence by Pope John XXIII, when he declared that, quote, the church presents herself as she is and as she wishes to be, the church of all, and in particular, the church of the poor. He recalled how Cardinal Leccaro, Archbishop of Bologna, declared in December 1962, this is the hour of the poor, of the millions of the poor throughout the world. According to the Cardinal, the liturgical renewal aimed to restore simplicity and sobriety to worship. Again, it's an opportunity or a cause of impiety, the traditional masses. And we needed to restore sobriety because apparently the TLM is not a sober mass. You ever been to a low mass? Or even a high mass? High masses are very sober. To worship so that the church might more clearly present herself as the Lord's own rather than the servant of worldly power. Again, saying it serves to spread impiety. You can only say that worldly power. Who is the Lord of the world? It isn't Jesus Christ. Yes, he is the king of creation. But the Lord of the world is the devil. Scripture makes that clear. The saints make it clear. The magisterium makes it clear. So the TLM presents herself as the servant of worldly power. Cupich wrote, the liturgical reform benefited from scholarly research, meaning modernist research, into liturgical resources, identifying those adaptations which had transformed the liturgy's aesthetics and meaning, making the liturgy more of a spectacle rather than the active participation of all the baptized. Let him be anathema. Purifying, meaning removing those adaptations, was, he argued, essential if the Eucharist was to regain its proper meaning. And what is its proper meaning? Making a better world. This is snowballing for him. The statement forms part of a broader discussion of the post-conciliar reform of the Roman Rite, which in the 1960s replaced the traditional Latin Mass. Don't call it the Tridentine Mass. It was not created by the Council of Trent. It was formalized as the primary, but not sole, form of the liturgy in the Latin West. After all, the Carmelite use and the Dominican rites all exist. I did the Ambrosian Rite and the Sarum use and a bunch of others at the time. But the normative rite for all of the West, not just in Italy, but there were, the Spanish missions in Mexico would have been saying this form of the Mass. With the revised form of the liturgy, commonly called the Novus Ordo Missae, the reform followed the constitution of the sacred liturgy, yada, yada, yada. And it goes on, the traditional Latin Mass codified by Pope Pius V after the Council of Trent continued in limited use but saw revival. It gives you basically a bunch of history on this. But Cupich essentially violated two anathemas of the Code of Canon Law, or not Code of Canon Law, but from the Council of Trent, or so it appears on the surface. And I'm very curious. Do you think this is going to be enforced for him? Think anybody's going to inform him of this? No. There is no one in Rome who cares enough that they will do anything about this. Ronnie says, even if you assume that accretions to the Mass came over from how royalty was honored, wouldn't Christ deserve even the greater honor? Seems like a poor argument. Oh, it's extremely poor. Christ is king. Scripture makes that pretty clear, that we are to honor him, even with wealth and lavish-looking things. The argument to strip it down of most of its beauty, that are accretions from the royal courts, has the whiff of that scene in Scripture where Judas is whinging on about how they're wasting the money to honor Christ when it could have been given to the poor. That's what it looks like. That's why their spiritual father is Judas Iscariot. But that is essentially what he's facing. And there's been some reactions to this as people had an opportunity to really read what Cardinal Cupich had to say. Phil Lawler, whose work I do occasionally cite on this channel and reporting the news, he runs the Catholic Culture blog. He says, Cardinal Cupich says, the traditional liturgy is more of a spectacle rather than the active participation of all the baptized, for them to be formed to join in the saving action of Christ crucified. Funny, that's exactly how I would describe the Synod on Synodality. And that is true. The Synod on Synodality is a spectacle. It's a grotesque spectacle. But there's more pushback finally coming to what Cardinal Cupich had said. He's 76 years old, going to be 77 in March, and is of sound mind and body from the looks of it. So it appears that he will be continuing to serve the Pope until the Pope has no need for his services anymore, or that Cardinal Cupich goes to his particular judgment. I don't think he'll be gone even when he's 80. But Joseph Shaw, writing in the Telegraph, posted it to X, but here's the actual article. He says, it's time the Catholic Church ended its war against its own traditions. The reverence, silence, and beauty of the Latin Mass inspires supporters across the spectrum. There are people from every wing of the internal church divide who want the traditional Mass restored. I've told you before about how there's a certain segment of self-described traditional Catholics that if you scratch them, they bleed Marxist red. They have great liturgical taste. Theologically, they understand the differences in the traditional Mass and the Novus Ordo and all these other things. But when it comes to Catholic social teaching, they're Marxists. I've met them. I've argued with them many times. They exist. But it goes on to give you this article starts off by giving you a lot of history about the traditional Mass and all those kinds of things. And then it goes into how young people today are being drawn to the traditional Mass, which is objectively good. You'd think that would be good. But then it gets to here, quote, one of the more recent tactics of progressives has been to attempt to link the Latin Mass to extremist politics. Again, calling the Mass essentially a vehicle for impiety. In 2017, for example, the Jesuit priest Antonio Spadaro coined the phrase ecumenism of hate to describe the Trump-supporting alliance between conservative Catholics and evangelical Americans. Such attempts, however, have been unconvincing, and churches report that the number of worshippers attending the Tridentine Mass is on the rise, even if the overall share remains small. In Britain, it finds supporters across the spectrum. Jacob Rees-Mogg is famously a fan. George Galloway called it poetry in motion in an interview with the Telegraph, while artists and musicians signed a 2024 petition to save it, and continues to inspire monks and friars to embrace a call to radical poverty. And then he goes on to say he thinks that Pope Leo is signaling another reversal of policy. I actually am skeptical of that, but we shall see. That would be beautiful if he did that. I'm skeptical. But you're seeing this. Everyone is noting that Cardinal Cupich is calling the Mass and has a history of calling the Mass a moment for impiety, and that those who have been the biggest advocates for crushing it are calling it a fuel for impiety. That it essentially is harmful to your soul. Council of Trent declared that to be an automatic excommunication, and yes, that is still in force. These anathemas enacted by ecumenical councils from before Vatican II are still in force. They have not been rescinded by a council. I'm very curious, though, what you think of this in the comments, please. As Jay Daly says, it would be enforced if Archbishop Vigano said it. Right. I mean, they excommunicated him falsely for some ridiculous things. So, yeah, they would absolutely enforce it. But it's not the only story worth talking about today. I have an update on the Opus Dei situation. They're trying to break up Opus Dei, but they may not be able to. And the reason it goes back to why they didn't crush the Legionnaires of Christ. Remember Maciel? Maciel? Before McCarrick, there was Maciel. Monster of a human being. A monster of a priest. A man who should never have been in the priesthood, let alone founding and running essentially a priestly fraternity. But here we are. That's what he did. And after all of his wickedness was exposed and played out through the media and in Vatican hearings and all the rest of it, the Legionnaires of Christ still exist. They still have seminarians. They still have priests who proudly identify themselves as Legionnaires of Christ, who say they find the charisms of the order, which are always come from the founder, Maciel in this case, to be a beautiful thing. It's a very strange attitude to have to an organization so deeply, deeply connected to some of the greatest evils that were conceived and enacted upon by any member of the clergy in our time. But now we know why they haven't been crushed and why the Opus Dei will probably survive the latest attempt to reform them. This comes from Gloria TV. The headline is "The Corporate Architecture of Opus Dei and Why Rome Never Dissolved the Legion of Christ." And it has to go back to money. Money is part of it. Ironically, the Vatican's lusting after the financial resources of the groups they try to get dispatch with, who are too traditional looking, might actually protect Opus Dei in this. Odd how that works. And if we'll go to the article now, it'll show you why. The story of the Legionaries of Christ is repeating itself with Opus Dei, writes Info Vaticana. Rome never dissolves what it cannot inherit. After the devastating scandal of its founder, Maciel, a tale of James Martin inclinations, deceit, and immense wealth, the logical move would have been for the Vatican to dissolve the congregation Legion of Christ. But that's not what happened. Why? Because the Vatican discovered that the Legion's assets were not actually church property. Every university, residence, and institution was owned by private foundations and corporations, each with its own board, its own accounts, and watertight legal documentation. To dissolve the order would have meant inheriting debts without touching a single euro of assets. So the Vatican chose the sensible path, to let the Legion fade away under its own weight. Info Vaticana finds the same pattern now at Tor Ciudad, the monumental Marian shrine linked to Opus Dei in Spain. Like the Legion, it combines a grand spiritual image with an even grander civil architecture. Since 2021, the sanctuary itself has been owned by the foundation Santuario de Nuestra Señora de los Ángeles de Toda. There's only a right of use in favor of Opus Dei, meaning Opus Dei has first right of use of the shrine. The surrounding 19 hectares, including buildings and facilities, belong to Immobiliaria Aragonesa S.A., a private corporation tied to Opus Dei's circles. In 2014, this company granted a 20-year free usufruct until 2035 to the Patronato de Toda Ciudad, a civil non-profit association that manages the site. In other words, ownership rests entirely in private hands, not with the Vatican nor with the prelature of Opus Dei. When Rome tries to intervene, it finds itself lost in a labyrinth of contracts and corporate shields, and as always, ends up with nothing to seize but the air conditioning bill. And I have been covering the Opus Dei story, not because I'm a fan, because I'm not a fan of Opus Dei, but compare this to how the FSSP is. Their parishes. Let's say you're in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. There's an FSSP parish, and its property, I'm pretty sure, is owned by the Archdiocese. And that'll be the case in virtually any place you go. There might be a few exceptions, but for the most part, it's diocesan property. The FSSP operates in a diocese at the discretion of the bishop, who can then kick them to the curb anytime he likes. Most of them, even the worst among them, don't really do that because that would cause them an enormous headache in the media if they did that. But that is why, if you were going to place a bet on who will be dissolved first, fully dissolved, gone completely as an entity, it probably won't be Opus Dei, just like it won't be the Legionnaires of Christ, because everything about them, other than the organization itself, all the real assets belong to private groups, not the church. And weirdly, that is shielding these groups. Because if they dissolve the group, guess what happens? The debts get taken on by the Vatican with no access to the property to sell it off to offset those actions. Kind of wish religious orders could do this. Covered on this channel for years. The ongoing war to crush women's religious orders, mostly women's religious. Certainly there are plenty of orders of men's religious that have also fallen under the axe of the Vatican. But overwhelmingly, it looks like nuns and religious women in general who are the target of Rome. And they go after their property because it's not protected in the same way that Opus Dei and the Legionnaires of Christ's properties are. Maybe in the future, these religious orders can protect themselves in the same way that the Vatican has allowed the Legionnaires of Christ and Opus Dei to protect themselves. Now, that's probably not going to happen. It's probably why all these reform efforts have gone underway, as they dismantle Catholic institutions and replace them with the ape synodal churches institutions. They rein in and put a leash on all these other orders so they don't have the same problem they have with them that they've had with Opus Dei and the Legionnaires of Christ. They learned a lot from the Legionnaires of Christ episode. It's not what you would want them to learn. Not to let men like James Martin into the priesthood in the first place. I'm not saying that James Martin has ever committed deeds anything close to like what Maciel did. But it is people who have those inclinations that James Martin has such a weird interest in for a priest that did. It's undeniable to keep men like that out of the priesthood. That's a lesson they should have learned. But they did not. Instead, they learned the legal battle loophole and the rules around it and how to ensure possibly other groups don't get away with being protected from the reformist spirit, the spirit of the world that has infected the church. I'm very curious what you think about this, so let me know. When do you think Rome will require the FSSP and the Institute of Christ King celebrate the Anno Mass in Latin on occasion in order to promote unity, even though it's not in their charter? Not only is it not in their charter, they're actually canon law says you can't force a priest to offer a particular mass. I do think it's coming, though. I don't know when. Probably it will be after Leo addresses the traditional mass issue more broadly. Maybe even in that document. Whenever that happens. I don't expect he'll do it this year. Probably not even next year. He'll probably leave traditionalists hanging until he finally decides to act. But we'll see. I am not a believer that the FSSP are protected. They got a handwritten promise written on a napkin or a sheet of paper by Pope Francis that he signed, and he wrote it out in a formal way. It was a handwritten thing. The FSSP posted it to their website. It never appeared in the actual log of the official acts of the papacy, though. But their promise was to be able to offer the traditional mass in perpetuity forever. We'll see. Traditionis Custodes made it clear that every single Catholic who goes to the traditional mass is to be re-educated and taught about how wonderful the reform of the church was and how we should just basically ignore all the chaos that came after. I expect it'll be sooner rather than later, though. Let me know what you think about all this in the comments, please. Hit like or subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps a lot, too. Please pray for everybody here and everybody we talked about today, especially Cardinal Cupich. I would not want to be in opposition to the entire history of the church if I was ever in general, but especially if I was in my, twilight years like he apparently is. So let me know what you think about this. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.